There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.
I was in Paris on a writing assignment, and I had gone out with a friend that night, and I'd gotten really loaded on cognac, which I just thought was like the most sophisticated thing. I just felt like such a queenly individual. But as happens to me sometimes, I blacked out. The last thing I remember is walking into my hotel. And then the next thing I know, it's kind of like going in through a wormhole. See, normally when you black out, you fall asleep eventually. And so then you wake up and you're like, what did I do last night? But this time I kind of came out of it while I was still, walking around and doing things.
For Sarah Hepola, drinking felt like freedom. At first, she started young and then she kept going. The thing is, though, that when Sarah would drink, she would black out. And when I say that, I suspect you're probably imagining a wasted young woman who becomes more and more out of it until she passes out. And yes, that can be what someone during a blackout looks like from the outside. But that's not the case for all drinkers who black out. Passing out is slightly different. It's about losing consciousness. You're literally lying on the ground or on a bed or wherever, and from the outside it can look like being asleep. But blacking out can look very different. If you have blackouts, you can still look from the outside like you're conscious, because you are conscious. You just can't remember it afterwards. There have been recorded incidents of drunk people having blackouts and doing the regular things they do in their lives during those blackouts. Doctors performing surgery, pilots flying planes, women and men having sex. In fact, for Sarah Hepola, having sex is often one of the things she wanted to do during a blackout. And in this episode, you're going to hear about some of the dangerous, murky situations she found herself in during blackouts. Another misconception about blackouts is that there's something that only happens to long-term alcoholics or super heavy male drinkers. And Sarah says that's what she thought too, until it started happening to her. Because back in her 20s, she thought that alcohol was the gasoline of all adventure. She'd spent her days at work and her nights at cocktail parties and bars, where she was often the very last to leave.
I wanted a sense of my own specialness. I wanted to have a lion's roar, and drinking was a way to have that.
And when Sarah started blacking out, that's when the feeling of freedom was replaced with urgent questions. Where had she been last night? What had happened? What had she done? What had she said? How did she meet that person? Whose bed was she in?
I woke up in a dog bed in somebody else's house. And I was like, how in the hell did I get here?
I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter. Sarah Hepola is a writer and a podcaster and the author of the book Blackout, Remembering the Things I Drank to Forget. And heads up, this conversation is about alcoholism and addiction. So if you need help, call Lifeline on 13 11 14. And thank you to Lucy Quick from Thrivalist Sobriety for her assistance on this episode. Sarah Hepola, when was the first time you experienced what drunk feels like?
Oh my goodness. I was pretty young. I had been stealing sips of beer from my parents' fridge for a while. It was this weird thing where they gave me a sip of beer because they thought it would turn me off of the stuff. And instead I was like, oh my God, I love that. And I started sneaking it. But I didn't get drunk until the ripe old age of, I think I was 11. And I was hanging out with my cousin who was much older than me. She was 16. So I was with a lot of the older kids. There was nothing I wanted more than to be accepted and brought into that group of cool older kids that hung out. And I was at a party and somebody gave me a beer and I drank it. And then I had another one. And then the next thing I knew, I was taking shots. And, it was quite a entryway, I will say, because, the first part of the evening was me sort of like, this is how I've always wanted to feel. I felt funny. I felt, free. I felt like everybody was paying attention to me. I was 11 years old and I was sort of crippled by shyness at the time. And the ease with which I was talking to these cool kids was incredible. And then the evening kind of disappeared and I blacked out. And I woke up the next day and I was talking to my cousin and she was like, do you remember when you took your pants off and you ran around? And I was like, oh no, there's no way that I would have done that because I'm like super, super modest. I was like the kid that like changed in the locker room, like went into the bathroom stall. And she was like, yeah, you sat at the bottom of the steps and you said, everybody loved me more than you. And I was like, well, that does sound like me. And she was like, you had a blackout. And that was my first initiation into both the drinking world and also the plague that would beset me for my 25 years drinking, which is that when I drank to a certain point, I would lose my memory and I would black out. So that's where it started.
Most people think that blackouts and passing out are the same things, but what was described to you is you running around and saying things and talking. Can you explain the difference between blacking out and passing out?
Yeah, of course. It's the most common confusion. Passing out is when you basically fall asleep from drinking too much. But in a blackout, you're still walking and talking and interacting with people. It's kind of like it's an alcohol-induced amnesia. And one of the things that's central to the conversation about blackout is that there's no one way that somebody looks like when they're in the blackout. You can't necessarily tell that someone else is having them. So, people can talk about their jobs, their career. They can drive cars. They can drive planes. There are reports of people performing surgeries in a blackout. It's crazy stuff. But what happens is that the hippocampus gets disabled. The hippocampus is part of your brain that places short-term memory into long-term storage, and it gets disabled. So you're able to have this kind of like 2-minute access to your memories, but then it won't record. It's kind of the equivalent of having a conversation with somebody without pressing the record button. It happened, but you can't access it later. So that's the really dastardly thing about blackouts is that you're not recording what you're saying, but you're out in the world interacting with people and talking to them.
And when you're out in the world, I mean, you mentioned flying a plane and doing surgery. I presume those people were pilots and surgeons before.
Yes, we can presume these were very high-functioning alcoholic drinkers plagued by blackout. And that also it is a very, very minor part of the blackout story writ large. Most people are like, flashing strangers and falling in streets. It's not nearly so so noble.
But what you're talking about is almost like an autopilot. So it sounds a bit like sleepwalking, or when little kids sometimes have night terrors where their eyes are open and they're talking and they're distressed, but they're actually asleep.
Yeah, it has a lot of similarities to sleepwalking. The difference is that you are conscious. You're talking with people. It's just that you just can't remember it. And you can be fairly lucid in a blackout, especially if you're somebody that drinks a lot. It's just like anything else. Like, I'm sure you've talked to people that have had like a couple beers and they seem like they're under the table. And then you can talk to somebody that's had like a bottle of wine or 2 bottles of wine and they're completely fine. So it's all sort of dependent on the individual. So there's not really one way that a blackout looks. I mean, I think I have a line in the book where like there's no red indicator light when your brain has shut down. But that's what's starting to happen, is that your memory is not recording. But you have something called procedural memory, which basically means like you can tie your shoe. That's why you can do all these sort of other things. The brain is something of a mystery to us, how it works. But this is what neuroscientists have figured out about this thing. Although I should say that blackout is still something that's kind of under-researched and still something of a mystery.
What makes you more likely, like what are the risk factors for someone who has blackouts, and how common is it? It's a lot more common than we used to think, right?
Yeah, it's actually quite common. There was a researcher that started doing studies on binge drinking in the aughts. And one of the things he found was that like 50% of the students at this university, it was at a college called Duke University in the States, 50% of them were experiencing some kind of blackout. And I should clarify that there's two kinds of blackout real quick. There's something called a fragmentary blackout, which is just sort of like little snippets that are missing. And this is by far the more common blackout. So this is where like maybe you remember leaving the bar, but you don't remember like getting in the cab, but you remember the drive home. Like there's little patches that are missing. And then there's something called en-bloc blackouts, which is two words, ENBLOC. And those are the really much more dramatic forms of blackout, which is where you lose like hours of time. Those are the kind that I had. But to answer your question, because I think it's really important, what are the risk factors for blackout? Well, some of them are, skipping meals, which I did all the time. If you're somebody that is trying to like maintain your weight and then also drink your face off, which I was always trying to balance that table, I would skip meals. Well, that's one of the easiest ways because blackout comes from a spike in the blood alcohol content. It's basically like a bunch of the alcohol hitting your blood all at once. So empty stomach, taking shots, drinking hard liquor. And then the other one is being female. Women are more prone to blackout than men are, which has to do with the ways that our body metabolizes alcohol. It's the same reason why binge drinking guidelines, at least here in the States, are like 4 for women and 5 for men. It's not just that we're smaller, although we often are. It's that there is a certain way that our body metabolizes alcohol that makes us more susceptible to its effects. And so more women black out than men. There are also genetic links to it, although that part is a little bit mysterious to us. But it does seem like it runs in families. I spoke to a researcher once that was telling me about that. I don't know if she's published her research yet, but I'm Irish and Finnish. And those are very strong drinking cultures. And I've talked to a lot of Irish and Finnish people that are like, yep, blackout. Indeed. So yeah, there's something about it that runs in the family. But, one thing to say is that blackout drinkers tend to be the ones that can hold their liquor, which I think is an important point. I was always really proud of being that girl that could drink like the guys and hold her liquor. I didn't throw up. And part of what happens when you're doing that is that the alcohol is hitting your system so much. I mean, yeah, I wasn't throwing up, but my body was finding other ways to compensate. And part of that was this blackout experience.
Blackout used to be thought of something that would happen like in end stage alcoholism or big guys who were really, really heavy drinkers. But the risk factors that you explained just then sound particularly prevalent in teenagers, because that's kind of how you drink when you're at college or at uni or you're just starting to drink and you're in your early 20s. What were your teenage years like?
Yeah, you're exactly right about that. Funny enough, well, I didn't drink. I got that really crazy early start at 11 and I was still drinking at like 13, but this was more like very isolated incidents. Through high school, I was really involved in drama and I didn't drink as much. And I think those are really related. I had to be at practice all the time. I was concerned about how I looked in front of an audience. I was really vigilant. It was really when I went to university that things went wild for me. I could drink sort of without any boundaries, without any checks and balances. There's a reason why, a lot of the blackout discoveries were done among binge drinking studies at universities, because that is how a lot of college kids drink. They drink with abandon. They drink to get drunk. I remember when I was first starting to worry about my drinking and a therapist asked me, do you ever drink to get drunk? And I was like, what on earth? Like, why else would you drink? Like, I thought it was the most absurd question. There is a lot of intentionality around this idea of kind of oblivion drinking. And in fact, in the years after I was in college, there is a phrase, let's get blackout. I don't know if the kids still use that, but here in the States, it was very common to kind of ring in an evening of excessive drinking with like, let's get blackout. In some ways, they're talking about kind of like, let's get smashed or let's get wasted. I mean, in some ways, you're being literal. Like, let me drink so much I don't remember the night. And then it's also just sort of like a turn of phrase to say like, let's go to the extreme. But yeah. Young people like to play around with that line. I was no exception. I started worrying about my drinking when I was 20. I'm sorry, I wasn't even 21. I was about 20 years old, and I was having these really big blackouts, and friends were starting to come up to me and say things like, "Hey, do you remember what you said last night?" And, that was just the worst way to start a conversation. When somebody asks you, "Do you remember what you did last night?" It's usually just not going to be a good thing. But, I was so young, I didn't really know how to manage my alcohol or step away from alcohol, because alcohol was sort of the linchpin that held all of my social life together.
It also became a way to have stories and be more interesting, you say. You say you felt kind of boring, like everyone had these fun stories, and then you realized that drinking gave you stories. What kind of stories did it give you?
Well, I think I'd always struggled with this sense of not being interesting, feeling like I was a little less, like I went to school with a lot of really super smart people. I was always intimidated by their intelligence, by their voracious reading. I wanted a sense of my own specialness. I wanted to have a lion's roar, and drinking was a way to have that. I think as I got older and I became a writer, especially when I was in New York. I moved to New York in my early 30s. And then it really felt as though drinking kind of laid the path to adventure. You would kind of just get drunk and see what happened. And I wanted to be one of those women that was so bold in the world and made things happen. What are some of the stories that I had? I mean, back in college, it would be stuff like, silly stuff like I stole a traffic cone, or I stole a promotional sign, and I put it back in our apartment, and isn't this hilarious? Just goofy stuff like that. But it kind of makes you feel like you're living life. I was essentially a good girl. I was essentially somebody that wanted everybody to like her. I didn't want to upset anybody, So drinking gave me access to this far more rebellious character that was sort of like double barrel, flip off to everyone. That's not how I was in my day-to-day life. When I got to New York, a lot of the stories were more, this was the Sex and the City era. This was the era of sort of like, I met this guy in a bar and went home with him, and it was crazy, and he's a chef, and isn't it wild? And in the next day, there's sort of like these high fives, like, yeah.
You tell your war stories.
Yeah, you tell your war stories. And it sort of reinforces this sense that you're a woman of the world, a woman to be reckoned with, that you're kind of setting the world on fire. At least that's what I sort of told myself. And I think also part of this was that I was a single woman. A lot of my friends were married. They had kids. I felt an added pressure to kind of have a dating life of some consequence. And drinking just sort of all conspired in there to make it seem as though my life was a little bit more exciting than it was when I was sitting around watching reality television with my cat.
When you started working, you had a boss that drew your name in like a secret Santa.
Yes.
Can you explain what he gave you for a present and how it made you feel?
Sure. So this was in my early 20s. I was working at a very cool alternative news weekly in Austin, Texas, which is a very cool city in Texas. And this was a place where living a less ordinary life was certainly celebrated. They had all come from kind of countercultural backgrounds of heavy drug use and pot smoking and popping pills in the 70s and 80s. Well, I was this binge drinker, that liked to cut wild at parties. And so my boss, the editor of this newspaper, drew my name in a secret Santa contest, and he gave me one of those hard hats that has beer slots on either side. And he said, "This is so you can drink more at work."
Ooh.
I mean, what did I think of that? I probably thought I worked at the best place in America and that they understood me. And, I felt accepted in this gang of oddballs and substance abusers.
Because that was a badge of honor.
Yeah. I mean, I was 23, 24 years old. So I thought it was hilarious. And now, of course, I look back on it and I think it's very strange.
And there was a Christmas party where you ended up somewhere that you didn't expect.
Oh my God, yes. Oh, that was horrible. Yeah. That was the following Christmas party. I had really killed in karaoke. I need to make that clear. But I had one of these blackouts and I woke up in a dog bed in somebody else's house. And I was like, how in the hell did I get here? And the dog was like nudging me with his snout, kind of like, what are you doing in my bed? Basically, the short story on this is that one of my very dear friends from work had tried to take me home and I couldn't remember my own address. So he brought me back to his place. He tucked me into a bed. But in the middle of the night, I got up to go to the bathroom. And when I got back, I was so confused. I curled up in the dog bed, which, just felt like a complete metaphor for where my life was at 25,
Yeah.
And, I was so embarrassed. I remember telling him that, like, just being absolutely mortified at that. And he walked out and was like, what are you doing in the dog bed? And when I realized what had happened, and like, I was like, please do not tell anybody this. And he was like, no, of course not. He was a very kind person. And then I went to work and told everybody that I'd woken up in the dog bed, and they were all roaring with laughter. It had become this sort of collateral for funny stories. This thing that had felt so degrading to me and shocking in the moment, give me a little breakfast and coffee, give me about 2 hours, and I'm turning it into comedy gold, So again, a lot of these early lessons were things that reinforced for me this idea that, like, this kind of excessive drinking was not only normal, but it was a path to the kind of creative and extraordinary life that I so badly wanted.
I was thinking when I read that part in the book about Nora Ephron's line that if you slip on a banana peel and people laugh, you're the victim of the laugh. But if you tell a story about slipping on a banana peel, you own the laugh and you basically reclaim that experience as something that you're in control of.
That's exactly right. Yes, absolutely. I think so many drinking stories are that, they're reclaiming a sense, because when you wake up and you don't remember what happened, I just have to say, I don't know how many people in your audience might have had the experience of a blackout. But it is a thunderously wrong thing to wake up and not remember how you got there. It doesn't make sense. It feels like some part of the world has sort of been tilted on its axis. So I do think that, the telling the jokes, the being lighthearted about it, and people want to be, they don't want you to feel bad too. I mean, like there were several years where my friends were sort of like, it's fine, it's no big deal. And then, they get a little bit tired of the jokes. And then at some point, you're not so fine.
Do you remember when people stopped laughing?
It came in different phases, but there was definitely this part of my early 30s. I was sort of 32, 33. And I remember people just wouldn't laugh the way that they used to. Me falling off my bar stool wasn't really a good punchline anymore. It was kind of like, are you okay? What's going on? I started to get friends who would come up to me and say, I'm worried about you. Worry was sort of the first phase. And I'd be like, no, I'm fine. And then what I remember really clearly is a friend of mine telling me that I had embarrassed her. We had been out with a bunch of her friends from work. And, I thought I was being funny. I thought I was being hilarious. I thought I was doing the thing that got everyone the laughs, I was just doing my little dance. But I was very drunk. I was very loud. None of them were as drunk as I was. That was also always a problem for me, was that my drunkenness sort of exceeded the current hour. I was kind of like 2 a.m. drunk at 8 o'clock.
Because you drank fast.
Because I drank so fast. Yeah, I really did. For that reason, a lot of times I would do the typical thing, like I would cut out. Like I stopped drinking in bourbon in my 20s. because I had so many blackouts that were really wretched. Then I cut out vodka, and then I cut out red wine, and then it had, you just kind of like, you're going down a list of like things that you are not going to work. And my list was kind of growing.
Coming up, I ask Sarah about the very specific shame and mortification of having to ask her partner at the time what she'd done the night before, and the embarrassment of what he told her. Tell me about relationships.
Mm-hmm.
You were with someone who was sober when you were like younger, and then you were with someone who matched you drink for drink.
Mm-hmm.
What are the different ways that alcohol affected your relationships in your 20s and early 30s?
Well, when I was 23 and I was first starting to worry about my drinking, I fell in love with somebody that was sober. I think it's probably a sign for both of us that we were reaching for something else. Like I wanted some life that wasn't just stuck in the party loop. I think he was wanting to get back to his drinking life. He eventually started drinking a few years later. But, at that time, the hardest thing was that I really loved drinking in order to be physical with somebody. And it just didn't make sense to me at all that you wouldn't be drunk and then want to make out. And he really thought it was just completely strange to make out or have sex with somebody that was loaded. And, this really predates a lot of our conversations around consent and, how much is too much. These are conversations that we've seen in the culture come in the last 5 to 10 years. But this is back in the 90s when that just wasn't as common. And, so I was always trying to drink like just enough to have fun, but not too much that he'd be mad at me. And it was a very difficult balance, but I was always very grateful for that relationship because he taught me that you can move through the world without this crutch of alcohol. He was somebody that you would never have known he wasn't drinking at a party. He was a really cool guy. When I was in my late 20s, I dated somebody that, the bar was our second home. We matched each other drink for drink. Unfortunately, he was a foot taller than me. So it had a different effect on me than him. Alcohol became a constant fight between us.
In what way?
Well, I think I would fall down staircases. He's also somebody that told me I embarrassed him. And it was my own friends. So I didn't even understand why I'd embarrassed him.
The shame of that. Like in the moment, did you get defensive? Did you just sit with the shame of it? Did you just write it off? How did you handle that when people said that you embarrassed them?
When he said that I embarrassed him, I was very ashamed. But I also thought he was being... Honestly, I thought he was being kind of a jerk because they were my friends. And, I didn't perceive that there had been a problem. I think he was more right, but he could have said it a different way. This was somebody that he wasn't always the most tactful. And so I could always attack him on that, right? It's not about the drinking. It's about the fact that you're being a jerk while you're saying it. Looking back, I completely understand why he didn't like having to come pick me up places, take care of me. And it gets a little bit old after a while. One of the things that I did that I think, just didn't work was that I tried to outsource my limits to him. I would do this thing that was sort of like, okay, I'm going out. I only want to have 2 drinks. You need to cut me off. And so then he'd try to cut me off. But 2 drinks in, I was like, no, forget it. I'm totally drinking. This is like, stop it. And so like a lot of tension came from that. And, it's not a surprise that he broke up with me ultimately. I remember seeing an alcohol therapist around that time. I didn't want to quit drinking, but I knew I had to address this problem that when I started drinking, I just couldn't stop. And so I saw an alcohol therapist and she told me, look, women will stay with guys that drink too much. I don't know why. I don't think they should, but they often do. They thrive in the caretaker position. Men won't do it. This guy is going to leave you. And he did. But I could not figure out how to date somebody if I wasn't drinking. Because to me, that was like the key to my softer moods, key to my feeling sexual and being comfortable in my own body. And so without that, I just didn't know how to have that kind of closeness. So I sort of felt like it was catch-22, you know? I could quit drinking and I wouldn't be comfortable with him, or I could keep drinking, hope we figure this out, and maybe he leaves me, which he did. And then I moved to New York in order to get hold of my drinking, which was one of the stupider things I've done, but still glad I went to New York.
I want to ask you about that in a second, but I want to ask you about sex first of all. You were single for a lot of those years, and you talk about the connection for you between sex and alcohol. Looking back, do you think that you needed alcohol to make you sexually uninhibited, or did you actually get legitimately turned on when you were drunk? And what are some of the situations you ended up in because of that?
I think I've just had such an inhibition in my body from a very young age. I hit puberty when I was about 10, which was really early. And I was young for my class, so it was kind of conspicuous to be the youngest girl in class who also happened to be the first to develop.
Yeah.
And I think it created a dissociation for me in my mind, you know, that I was never fully in my body. And alcohol was the thing that made that sort of all felt like it like blended together. It all felt seamless, you know, me, my body. It sort of felt almost, this is going to sound corny, but like almost sort of like spiritual or something like that. Like I felt kind of like that's why they call them spirits. I mean, you know, like there is a certain feeling where like the spirit inhabits you. And I certainly felt that way. I also think that a lot of that behavior on my part was driven by an idea I had that men having sex with me meant that I was attractive and pretty and sexy. You know, I really wanted that validation. So it's very hard for me to untangle, you know, what is like my desire? What is the disinhibition of alcohol? What is the social programming of like guys wanting you means that you're valuable? But as far as some of the things I wound up in, I mean, goodness, well, I mean, I open up my book with a story that's pretty wild. I was in Paris on a writing assignment, and I had gone out with a friend that night. And I'd gotten really loaded on cognac, which I just thought was like the most sophisticated thing. I just felt like such a queenly individual. But as happens to me sometimes, I blacked out. The last thing I remember is walking into my hotel. The next thing I know, it's kind of like going in through a wormhole. See, normally when you black out, you fall asleep eventually. And so then you wake up and you're like, what did I do last night? But this time I kind of came out of it while I was still, you know, walking around and doing things. And I came out of the blackout and I was having sex with this guy and I had no idea where he'd come from. And I had no idea who he was. And I was on top. And I seemed to be making sounds of pleasure. And it was just the weirdest thing. I mean, I literally did not know who he was. That had never happened to me before. I have since, you know, it's obviously it's in the book. And since the book has been out for several years, I've heard from a number of people who have also had this experience. It is talk about thunderously wrong. It's just totally... And I was so numb. I was just sort of so numb and confused. I thought maybe you asked earlier about dreams. I mean, I kind of thought maybe I was having a dream. And then, you know, as the fog lifted, it was becoming clear what was going on.
So what did you do?
Man, I faked my way through the rest of that. Gotta go. Plane leaving tomorrow
Early
morning.
meeting.
Look at the time. Goodness, this was fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Sort of bolted from the room after I'd done the sort of requisite hang out for a little bit. And then I was walking back to my room and then I realized that I didn't have my purse. And, you know, this becomes kind of like a whole center of a chapter in my book where I'm kind of unraveling this mystery of like, where the hell have I been tonight? What's happened? Who was that guy? I didn't even know what door I'd come out of. I enlist this concierge to help me. It's this whole unraveling of a night. It went on for hours and it just kept getting worse. It was one of those nights that, look, I was certainly not then a very religious person. When I got back to my bed that night, I just was like, God, if there is a God, I am never drinking again. I got out of this whole scrape, and I meant it. But, I drank the next day on the plane ride home. So
people talk about hitting rock bottom. Mm-hmm. It sounds like you hit rock bottom, but you bounced.
That's a good way to say it. I think a lot of us do that.
Pretty fast.
Yeah, I remember somebody telling me when I started trying to get sober, he said, you hit your knees, but you get up real quick. And that is what happened for several years for me. I would be leveled by something and I would think that's it. And then about 3 days would go by and I would be like, well, that was really dramatic. I don't think I need to quit drinking entirely. Because look, there are a lot of people that have kind of socially enforced heavy drinking problems that can cut back on their own. They might not have something that they would term alcoholism or an addiction or whatever, they can cut it back. And I needed to see if I might be able to be one of those people. So I tried very valiantly. I tried for years to just try to drink like a normal person. For me, my story eventually led to AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and, that was not a place I wanted to go. So, before I was going to sign off on that part of my life, I wanted to try every damn thing, every other door there could possibly be for me. So it took a while, and it was a lot of me kind of swearing it off and taking it back. And I think a lot of us have had relationships like this. I mean, if you've been in a relationship that I'm never talking to that guy again. And then 3 days later, it's like, I wonder what he's doing right now. Yeah. Look, sometimes our humiliation has a very short life cycle, unfortunately.
How many times did you quit?
Oh my gosh, I wouldn't even be able to quantify it because it was over years. And, it was a lot on Monday mornings, Sunday nights. I would often drink white wine and kind of think, all right, this is the end. Like I'm saying goodbye to it. Like I'm doing my ritual. And then Monday morning I would stop. And then, by Wednesday or Thursday, it's like the jungle drums start to pound again. And you just start wanting that, couldn't I have just a little bit? Maybe just one glass, And then with me, it was kind of like always falling down the rabbit hole again.
The last time you quit was when you were 35, right? And it was around 12 years ago.
That's right, yeah.
What was different about that time?
I think I actually didn't think. I had quit so many times before that I didn't really think this was going to be it. But I was losing hope for myself. I was getting very, very tired. I didn't really think I was going to die, but I kind of saw the future stretch into the distance. And it was just kind of like this same conveyor belt of me being this little lush that somebody carried out of a bar and placed into a cab. And, I'd had so many nights like that. And I'll never know exactly why that time clicked. I know it's been very valuable for me to see that that's happened, because I don't know if you've ever been trying to quit something and you can't do it and you can't do it and you can't do it and you start to lose faith in yourself. I had lost faith in my own ability. I didn't really believe myself when I said that I quit. So the fact that I was able to kind of reconfigured what I thought was possible, I now knew that I could do something that I had repeatedly tried and failed to do, which means that every time now when I try and fail to do something, I say, well, actually I might not. I've proven myself wrong before. But, I think really central to me was accountability. Like a lot of people, I was trying to quit in a vacuum. I was trying to quit without anyone knowing that I had a problem so that I could sort of fast forward through the hard part and get back to the part where everybody liked me again and I was good. And, but I will say that like on the first night that I was sober, I called my mom, and I have a very close relationship with my mom. And I had been living in a different city, and I was really able to kind of disguise how bad my drinking had gotten. But I really let her in on that. And I think a couple things happened there. One is that when you make yourself accountable, now my mom knows I have a drinking problem. I can no longer hide that I have a drinking problem. I called it in one essay, I called it, I destroyed all my hiding places. Like I can't pretend like this doesn't exist anymore. But two, I disrupted the illusion that I was only hurting myself. And I think that was really central for me. I had always thought, well, like, why does anyone care if I'm drinking so much? Because it's just me. It's just my life. I'm not hurting anybody. And this was one of the ways that I started to disrupt that story that I was telling to myself, that actually people were worried about me, people that loved me didn't want to see me in danger, that I was repeatedly endangering myself. I mean, one of the dastardly things about blacking out is that you don't actually remember it. And so, I mean, I know that sounds obvious, but like, I just mean on a philosophical level, if you can't remember what you did, it's really hard to kind of feel the moral weight of that. So when people would say like, oh, you did this terrible thing, I'd be like, oh, I don't remember it. Like, I'm not saying it wasn't me, but like, it kind of wasn't me. Like I had a moral distance from stuff that I didn't remember doing. So my friends that had to be accountable for me during that time, that had to watch out for traffic as I crossed the street, that had to make sure that I was home, like all of that was weight on them that I hadn't really appreciated. So, I think those were two key factors for me in knowing that I just wanted something different.
When you decide to get sober, do you sort of have to come out as an alcoholic first? Because you have to explain why you're not drinking, and then does that mean that you then have to have a conversation with all the different people about your drinking?
I think everybody does it different ways, right? I mean, a lot of people don't want to have that conversation. And so I've spoken to people that have just done a sort of like, you know what, I'm taking new medication. Or I even know people that will lie and say they're pregnant to people that they don't know. I think it's a little bit wild that it's such a fraught conversation that people would rather lie and say they're pregnant than just say like, hey, I'm actually taking care of a problem that I have. But the word alcoholic, woo, that's a doozy. And, depending on who you're talking to, depending on what their associations are with that word, what your associations are with that word, you may not want to have that conversation.
What were your associations with that word?
What are mine?
What were they at the time?
I mean, I thought of alcoholics as it's a very dramatic phase of like, you've lost everything and you're kind of like shivering under the highway. And, like I hadn't lost things yet. And so to me, it was like I still had my job. I still had my apartment. I was horribly in debt, by the way, horribly in debt. But it was New York and a lot of people are. I think it took a while for me to understand that alcoholism wasn't really a sort of like a measure of what you've lost externally. A lot of it is about a measure of what you've lost internally. And also, you don't have to drink that it's that bad. But what I found, I was nervous to tell friends. What I found was that most of my relationships got much closer by my sharing this information. The people that had a problem with me quitting drinking were mostly my fly-by-night bar buddies that didn't want to see me disappear from the bar. It turned out I wasn't that close to them. But I had a lot of people that were very dear to me. And, they did not turn away when I shared with them that, I had this problem and I needed to do something about it, especially my female friends. I mean, they were just incredibly supportive. I mean, to the extent, I think my guy friends, I'm not saying my guy friends weren't supportive. They were like, that's cool. But my female friends were like, let's go take a walk. Let's go do something else. Like they would get us out of the bar, which I thought was so kind.
I bet they were relieved too.
Yeah. I think a lot of them were relieved because they were worried about me, you know.
You talked about problems caused by drinking while you were dating, but also there were problems caused by being sober when you were dating. What did you have to relearn?
I mean, we have kind of created a dating and social life that pivots around having a couple drinks. I mean, this is like what people say to each other when they want to meet up, like on an app or something, like, hey, you want to meet for drinks? And part of it is just social custom. And part of it is this acknowledgement that meeting somebody out of the blue and maybe wanting to be in some way intimate with them later in the evening is going to take a certain amount of disinhibition, or, you know, like it's going to be tricky. And, you know, the way I had dealt with that in the past was like, let's just roll the dice, you know, like just get loose, see what happens, put yourself out there. And then when I was sober, it was like, oh my gosh, this is so scary. Like I was so in touch with how scary it was to meet another human being. I mean, this is going to sound goofy, but to have the possibility that they might, you know, inhabit this intimate space of yours. I mean, all of it just seemed like it was like really intense. I felt like I was back in 7th grade, you know? So it took a while for me to stop like running away from every date. You know, like the date would sort of start to wind down. I'd be like, okay, bye, guys, see you. Nah, see you later. You know, whereas back, you know, back in the day, it was just sort of like, oh, just roll the dice, see if you sleep with this guy or not. You know, I think what it started to bring home for me was, wow, sex really does mean something. It is something that I don't want to just give away. Maybe it can be casual, but for the most part, it's not casual for me. I had to learn to be a little bit more comfortable in my body, which I did. I was glad to find, you know, I'm many years into this thing now, and it really doesn't faze me at all that I'm sober when I'm dating. In fact, it sort of surprises me when it phases guys, because every once in a while, they'll sort of be like, I don't want to drink by myself. This is lame. And I'm like, okay, well, that's your decision, your problem. I don't, you know, for the most part, I find, you know, it actually doesn't come up that much.
When you were drinking and you were blacking out, did you think that you wanted to have children one day? And did you think, well, how would I do that if I was still drinking? Was that ever something that I'm sure it was something you thought about? If it's too personal to talk about, I understand that
it's just a long answer, and I'm trying to figure out how I'll answer it. I mean, I like that you asked me this question. I'm happy to answer it. I always wanted to have kids. I always wanted to push the line up as much as I possibly could before I had to call, you know, blow the whistle on the party train. I got pregnant when I was 31. My boyfriend had broken up with me and we were having makeup sex, and I thought about having that child, but I really thought that I drank too much. I didn't want to be a single mother, and I really wanted, I mean, I so badly wanted to do it the right way. It had everything to do with how much I prized the idea of being a mom.
Yeah.
You know, I thought it was really super special. I got sober at 35. You know, even during those years before, I would have these thoughts like, I should have a kid and maybe that'll make me stop drinking.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what I would think.
Yeah. But I didn't. I ended up quitting drinking at 35, and the next few years of my life were very focused on getting sober, moving back to Dallas, which is where I live in Texas, getting myself financially situated. I was so in debt. Writing a book.
Is that because of alcohol or just
life? It was because of trying to run with a crowd that I couldn't afford to run with, and because of New York being as expensive as it was, and being a very poor planner who never paid my freelancing IRS, it was just, I just got myself in a lot of trouble. And then it was a very difficult hole to get out of. It really came from the first 2 years that I was in New York when I didn't make enough money to live there, but I didn't want to leave. And then I was dragging that debt for years. So that was the focus of my life. And by the time the book came out when I was 40, I sort of was surprised to find like, oh my gosh, I really want to have a kid. And lo and behold, I am now 41 years old, which is a really tricky time to start thinking about having kids. So I looked into that. I'm working on a second memoir right now. And part of that is about dating in my 40s and also around the idea of having wanted kids, but not getting them. It was a challenging passage for me. And I still wonder if I'll adopt or foster a kid down the line. But it's often true, like in the sober community, you can find a number of women, who there's a lot of us that wish we had quit earlier so that we might have had a little bit more time, because that is something that I really just didn't pay enough attention to. I had some magical thinking ideas about the sort of runway that I had in terms of kids. I really sort of believed this hype that like, oh, you've got plenty of time, don't worry about it. And then it turns out you don't have plenty of time.
Thank you for your honesty about that. I always feel very cautious about pushing on that bruise because for most women, there's a story there. There always is, and it's never simple, and it's often it can still be very painful and tender. So
yeah, well, I'm glad that you asked me about it because I actually think that there are a lot of women like me that wanted to have kids and didn't get a chance to. And I just don't mind being a voice for that. I think there is a very active voice right now of people that didn't want kids and don't have to have them. Child-free community, and good for them. Why would you ever want somebody to have kids if they don't want them, right?
Well, unless you're a Republican.
Yeah, there are a number of us who it wasn't exactly a choice. It was sort of like circumstance, and that's just sort of how it worked out. I'm lucky enough that a lot of my friends have wonderful children and they let me be part of their lives.
I just want to finish by asking you about consent, because you've made me think so much about this issue since reading your book particularly. And I know you've written about this and you've had backlash to some of the things that you've written, because if someone is still walking and talking and able to fly a plane or perform surgery or, get themselves home, what are they able to consent to? And if they're blacked out and someone has sex with them?
Yeah. So I think this is something that gets lost in a lot of the conversations because people think blackout means passed out and they don't realize, this is really a legal gray zone right now. And what they're generally doing in legal cases here in the States is that, it's not whether or not you blacked out, it's whether or not you should have had a reasonable understanding of somebody's secondary signs of intoxication. In other words, were they slurring their speech? Were they falling down? Were there other signs? Like it's true, you cannot tell if somebody's in a blackout, but you should be able to tell if they're falling down. But, again, what's really difficult too is that if you don't know what happened, how are you the person that's controlling the narrative of what happened?
Yeah.
You literally don't have a memory of that. So, as far as I'm concerned, I think that there should be a lot more education around the fact that what causes blackout, you don't have to drink, you don't have to drink that way. What are the risk factors? And then also there is this area where I think that it's a lot more complicated than we're letting on in some of the conversations around consent. I knew that when I got drunk, I would often get very sexually aggressive. I knew that about myself. And I also came out of this blackout on top of this person. To me, that didn't feel like an assault. That felt like an assault on myself. By myself, by drinking so much. But, we're getting into territory that's very disputed. What constitutes rape and what constitutes sexual assault. We've broadened those definitions and it gets a little bit blurry when we're talking about alcohol in particular, because, most people don't carry around breathalyzers. And, how can you tell? And then you have the added complication that alcohol is for many people a mandatory part of their sexual life. So you have it both mandatory and then potentially criminal. I mean, it's a bad setup. We got to figure this out a little bit better. Which is one of the reasons why I felt so frustrated that there wasn't more conversation around what women were drinking. I understand that the first phase feminist conversation was don't put it all on us. I get that. I hear you.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, you also don't outsource your agency and your protection to someone else. Like, it's not on them to take care of you. You have to know what you did in your life.
Sarah, just finally, and I know I've said finally already, but I just love talking to you, and I know you probably want to get out of the cupboard, and you're so divine to give me this much time. Do you still want to drink? Like, do you still crave drinking? Do you miss it?
You know what I miss is just that fuck it feeling. Like when you've had like the worst day and you pull the cork out of the bottle and you're just like, fuck it. But I really don't miss drinking. And that sounds like I'm giving you a line, and it's really crazy to me, but I really do not miss drinking. What it feels like to me is like a switch that's just broken. It doesn't work. It doesn't do the thing that I want it to do. So I have sometimes craving for escape. I want to disappear.
Yes. Or block. Like, do you want to just like not feel the feelings?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just like,
Yeah. What do you do when you feel like that?
Well, for a while, I picked up a little like old-fashioned cigarette smoking habit for a little while.
Are you still a smoker?
I'm actually chewing nicotine gum while I'm talking to you. It got so hot in Texas, I stopped smoking for a little while. So I'm going to see how long I can keep that going. I'm now a nicotine gum addict. But I started smoking just because it was like I needed something to just kind of like offload the like frenzy of like, I need something right now. And I don't like to eat my feelings away, and I can't drink my feelings away. So unfortunately, I went to like smoke them away. Something. Which was very 70s and 80s of me. But
is there anything else that gives you that feeling?
I've learned things like that I can play my guitar to calm down. But honestly, when I'm like overwrought like that, like, no, I don't have it. That's why that's probably when I miss like just having that something that you could just like take me away.
How do you maintain your sobriety now?
Well, I'm still somebody that goes to meetings at Alcoholics Anonymous. I still go 3 times a week and tell my story, and I write about these subjects. And, I never want to get too far away from what I've gained. And, there was a time when I just didn't think it was going to be at all possible to quit drinking. And so the fact that I have 12 years now, that I can tell you that I have 12 years is absolutely crazy to me. And so much has come into my life because of that. I mean, I absolutely wrote that book because I quit drinking. I mean, I think I needed to prove to myself that I could do something that I hadn't done in my drinking life. And then certainly I've done many other things since then.
You've done a million things, and I want to thank you for all of them because I am such a fan. I love your writing so much. I love your podcasting. I love your book. I can't wait for book number 2.
Thank you.
And you make me think harder, and I love you for that.
Oh,
thank you. Sarah Hepola's book Blackout can be found now via the link in the show notes. It's not a new book, so you probably won't find it in a bookstore, but you can buy it online or to download. She also hosts a podcast called Smoke 'Em If You Got 'Em, which is not about alcoholism or drinking. It's actually about culture, and particularly about cancel culture. And look, whenever we do episodes that touch on alcoholism, they always get a huge response. So many people, so many women have issues with drinking and alcohol. And one of our most downloaded episodes, not just on this topic, but on any topic, was my interview with Shanna Wan from Sober in the Country. She speaks about her alcoholism in a way I've never heard about before, and we'll also link to that in the show notes. And remember, please reach out to Lifeline on 13 11 14 if you need support. The producer of No Filter is Emmeline Peterson. The executive producer is Eliza Ratliff, with sound production by Maddie Joannou. I'm Mia Friedman, and thank you for having me in your ears. From world-class podcasts to events, videos and articles, a Mamamia subscription gives you unlimited access to fascinating women's stories that you won't hear anywhere else, all for as little as $5.75 a month. Learn more about subscribing to Mamamia and supporting women's media.